The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the decorated combat veteran, author, and foreign policy expert. You are widely considered for your leadership during the Gulf War, where you orchestrated an offensive strike that destroyed 70 Iraqi armored vehicles in 23 minutes with no casualties, in what was the largest tank battle since World War II. You retired from the military in 2004 after 28 years of service and became a commentator on CNN, the BBC, and Fox News, where you regularly appeared on the Tucker Carlson show. In 2020, Donald Trump appointed you as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and you've written 5 books on military transformation. Regarding the war, you have said that Ukraine cannot win and that Russia is now more powerful and unified than ever. You also believe that President Zelensky is getting desperate and that supplying cruise missiles to Ukraine that can strike Russia is a quote-unquote invitation to disaster, one that could result in World War III. Colonel Macgregor, welcome back to London Real.
Thanks. If I could just make one quick correction. We had 6 casualties in 1991, 1 dead and 5 wounded, and we lost a Bradley fighting vehicle. So there is no cheap victory. Everything costs something. And the fighting actually lasted for several hours. It was just the initial breakthrough that you described. Anyway, just so people understand that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate those details, and they are important. I guess I wanted to start off with what we saw a few weeks ago with the Wagner Group and the quote-unquote coup that happened over this 48-hour period. We were trying to get news. There were Twitter spaces involved. There were things coming off on Telegram. And I got to tell you, Colonel, I was watching it, and I just didn't trust anything I was seeing or hearing. But at the same time, obviously, something was happening. And I'm really curious on how you monitored it in real time, what you were thinking in real time, and did your conclusions change 24 hours or even 48 hours after that?
Well, first, we have an old expression in the Army about battlefields or anything, frankly. The first report is always wrong. So whatever you hear quickly is usually inaccurate. I think the second part is that you're dealing with someone who is probably Russia's answer to reality TV in the United States. Prigozhin is an interesting character. He's entertaining. But it was not a coup. It was not an uprising. It was not a rebellion. And it was funny to watch all of the usual suspects in the West, the retired army generals in the U.S. and Britain and elsewhere. This is the end. Putin is finally going to be removed. It's all nonsense. This thing was never aimed at Putin in that sense. I think Prigozhin was giving voice to frustrations that are widespread in the senior ranks of the Russian military. And that is, look, this thing is taking too long. It's time for us to end this war. Effectively, let's attack and get this done. And that's not surprising. We felt that way in 1991. In fact, when we had information shortly before we attacked that there could be a peace negotiation again, we were all disgusted and said, look, we're here. We want to fight. Let's get this over with. That's not unusual in any force that's been sitting for as long as the Russians have been sitting. And remember, you got a lot of troops that haven't been employed yet, and they want to fight. But I think Prigozhin's other agenda was to save the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group is, remember, it's something more like the French Foreign Legion than anything else. We keep calling them mercenaries in an effort to diminish them or denigrate them. They're not mercenaries. It's really much more like the French Foreign Legion. And the French Foreign Legion is sworn to defend the French national state. Same thing is true for Wagner. They absolutely are devoted to Russia and committed to it. And he did not want to see it dismembered and abandoned. Well, ultimately, he kind of lost that battle because out of the sort of 25,000 or so, only 8,000 remain that have been moved or will shortly be moved to Belarusia. They were last in Luhansk. He bloviated as soon as it became clear that this was being mistaken for something else. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that the Air Force commander who committed attack helicopters against his small contingent of 3,000 or 4,000 did so on his own initiative, that was not ordered by Putin. But as soon as that happened, he said, look, this is not what we came for. And I think he was trying to make a point that he doesn't like the Minister of Defense, which is fine. But he really, really, really dislikes General Gerasimov, who is the chief of the general staff, who's now currently the theater commander. Well, that happens in war. And I'm sure he's not alone, as I've said. But beyond that, there was nothing much more to it. And I think we will see Wagner again in a different form operating out of Belarusia.
Has the group itself disbanded? Is it still there? What is the status of that?
About 2/3 of it was offered the opportunity to sign contracts with the Russian army, and they've done so. The other 8,000, as I said, are getting ready to move up to Belarusia as soon as the facilities to house them are finished. And Prigozhin has gone in and out of Moscow and back to St. Petersburg. Now, what happens with him at this point, whether or not he'll show up again, who knows? But he's certainly not the traitor that people thought he was initially. That wasn't his intent. He's enormously popular in Russia, as is the Wagner Group. I mean, these people are seen as heroes and with considerable justification for the fighting that they've done in places like Bakhmut. But the Russian population itself wants this war to be fought and won. They're sick of this long wait. But that has much to do with Vladimir Putin's view of things in the West and his desire to avoid a larger war with NATO and the United States.
And so what is the state of the union of this war? We're in July now. I guess there's not a huge window of actual fighting in this type of territory because of the winter and then the muds, et cetera. Where are we right now? Because, again, I referenced in the intro the possibility of cruise missiles being offered. We saw some of these old weapons being supplied by the U.S., but what kind of is the state right now? How do you read the war at this point?
Well, let's look at the Russian side first. The Russians are actually attacking up in the northeastern corner of this long line of defense that is sort of shaped like a banana in southern Ukraine. And they've made a lot of progress, aiming in the direction, generally speaking, of Liman in eastern Ukraine, but really towards Slavyansk. And those are road networks that would lead Russian forces on the offensive to go all the way to Kharkov very quickly, and actually to strike even further west and north towards Kharkov, or to swing around behind the Ukrainian forces that are down south. Those forces came out of the Beograd area. There's always been a tank army down there, along with a lot of other Russian forces that have yet to really be employed. And this offensive is being very successful right now. At the same time, the Ukrainians in small numbers, all up and down the line, have continued to launch attacks, all with no success at all, catastrophic losses. So the Russians are in good shape. They've taken some losses, but their losses are perhaps in the hundreds, maybe 1,000 wounded total. Nothing significant or severe that the Russians cannot absorb. The Ukrainian side's in a very different position. They were built up and pushed, I think, to launch these counteroffensives or counterattacks up and down the line to prove that there was still life in Ukraine, to attract more support. I think the rationale for it was much more political than military. And the losses they've sustained are horrific. The latest figures I've seen, somewhere is between 24 and 26,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died just within the last month as a result of these counterattacks. How many thousands of wounded have been added to the numbers that already exist, we don't know. I recently listened to someone talk about the numbers of dead lying all over eastern Ukraine, mostly Ukrainian, soldiers, some civilians, a few Russians, but overwhelmingly Ukrainian. I think the Ukrainian force is desperate and, frankly, on the point of disintegration. The morale over there is at an all-time low. I continue to hear these reports of there's low morale on the Russian side. I see no evidence for it. Can't find any. As I said before, the only thing that I see is this desire to attack, win, and get this over with. But the Ukrainians they've suffered terribly. And the Poles that are working in Ukrainian uniform as part of the Ukrainian army, along with a few other units, are the only ones left that are willing to attack. Everyone else has said this is preposterous. They do not have the ability to punch through the security zone, which ranges from 15 to 25 kilometers in front of the main defensive belts. They've never reached the main defensive belts. And this is not a surprise. From the very beginning, people thought that you could build an army for high-end conventional warfare on the fly. It can't be done. Armies take years to develop, to build. Their culture has to evolve. They have to have an officer corps that evolves into a professional force. They need institutions that support the training, the equipping, and the organization. None of these things were in place. Now throwing new pieces of equipment, whether they're obsolete or relatively modern, the Storm Shadow missiles, I think is what it's called from the British. Those are very effective, and some of them have penetrated, though others have been shot down. But on the other hand, we've just announced that we're purchasing Hawk anti-aircraft missiles from Taiwan and shipping them to Ukraine. Well, I guess the threat to Taiwan isn't nearly as great as we thought it was. So now we're taking equipment that we've already sold to the Taiwanese. They're selling it back to us, shipping it to Ukraine. It's not going to make any difference. It's obsolete anyway. The Russian air defenses are superb, is the best word that I can come up with. There is no such thing as perfect integrated air defenses. Something will always get through, but overwhelmingly, they've managed to shoot down HIMARS and all sorts of missiles. This isn't going to change anything. And I think that's the frustration that we saw in Mr. Zelensky. He was furious, angry, distraught. He thought that he was going to be embraced, that we were going to extend the nuclear umbrella, per se, to him by making him part of NATO. Although I personally don't have any faith in extended nuclear deterrence. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people that think it's still meaningful. He didn't get what he wanted. He's bitter. He's angry. The losses inside the country are horrific. It's only American cash that really sustains this Ukrainian state. It's on life support. And the humane thing would be to put an end to it and negotiate, but it's not going to happen. And I think that's really what is next on the agenda is in Moscow, in the discussions at high levels. I think they're going to finally say, unless we finish this and attack, go on the offensive, there will be no end. Because sitting here in the South and killing large numbers of Ukrainians has not persuaded the West, certainly not Washington, to abandon this folly.
You said before that Putin is concerned about how the world views this. I found this interesting. From China to Africa to nations all around the world, he's concerned of the optics of this. And again, a lot of people would be surprised because here in Britain and in America, 90% of the mainstream media, it has already chosen its position on the Ukraine war. It doesn't even matter what happens on a day-to-day basis. We get fed just a cinder narrative. If there's any successes, they are multiplied. And if there's any failures, they are hidden. And so to explain why Putin cares of the optics of this, because we're also taught that he's this evil dictator that doesn't have any cares for anything. Right. Explain both of those narratives in your mind, and that might be a surprise to a lot of people who get their news from newspapers and television channels.
Well, remember that he's also conducting warfare against us on the financial level. Remember that he represents in the minds of many people around the world someone who has decided to challenge not just American military and political hegemony, but American and Western financial hegemony. The World Bank and associated institutions have effectively been puppets for U.S. and allied foreign policy. We have been in the business for decades of telling people in Nicaragua or Cameroon what kind of crops to grow. And if you don't do what we tell you to do, then we won't lend you the money that you want. We talk all the time about the Chinese supposedly blackmailing people by lending them lots of money and then holding them accountable. Well, we do the same thing, only we do it in more subtle ways that are actually more damaging to the society because we're very intrusive. We're not just interested in the specific project. We're trying to restructure people's societies, change their cultures. So you have people in Africa, Latin America, much of Asia, who are very sympathetic to the Russians, who are seen as standing up to this. And you know that they're trying to develop a new currency. It's going to take some years. It's not going to happen overnight. That is pegged to gold. And India, China, and Russia probably are sitting on the largest concentration of gold in the world right now. And a lot of us are beginning to wonder how much gold we've actually got under the streets in New York, London, and Fort Knox. And we'll have to find out at some point. But the bottom line is, this is a new era that is coming. And they've already got 40 plus nations willing to join this new currency. India, China, and Russia, of course, are at the center of this, at the core of it. And this is seen as a rebellion against our financial dominance that has been so, I would say, from their standpoint, certainly destructive in so many ways for so long. So that's part of it. The second part of it is he has given very, very specific orders to the Russian army in terms of how he wants them to behave. And if you're looking for a model, you've got to go back to Tsarist Russia, because the Tsar and the Tsarist forces, whatever they were, however imperfect they were a club of humanitarians compared to the evil Bolsheviks that replaced them. He has done everything he can to divorce the behavior and the attitudes and the culture of today's Russia from the Soviet Union and that evil past. I mean, he's not interested in slaughtering Ukrainians. He's been opposed to that from the very beginning. And he's always kept his eye on the ball in terms of, I want to live with everyone when this is over. And I think he's adopted Charles de Gaulle's position, which is Americans don't live in Europe. Britain is an island, and we're Europeans. And I think his assumption is that London and New York City and Washington will eventually give up and go away. He wants to get along with everybody else. He doesn't really need us. And see, this is the other problem that we never thought through very carefully. No one sat down, and we try to do this in the military. We don't succeed very much on the strategic level, but we try to ask the question of, what is the purpose of our operation? How are we going to do it? And what do we want things to look like when it's over? That's an important question. We didn't do that this time. We just said, we want to harm Russia. We want to remove Putin. We want to destroy Russia. We want to ultimately dismember it, if you read the things that people are saying, and strip it of resources. What are Putin's goals? Putin's goals are much more limited and always have been. He moved into Ukraine with about 90,000 troops. There were another 100,000 outside of it, but as far as going into Ukraine itself with 90,000, we were all shocked. I was one of them. What is he doing? I didn't understand what his point was. Well, his point was, I don't really want to wage war. I just want to signal to you that I'm serious. We're not going to tolerate this platform for the projection of dangerous military power against my country. It's not going to happen. We won't tolerate it. And so we all said, well, look how bad the Russians are. They don't know what they're doing. And look how small this army is. Well, all that's being corrected. They've got 750,000 troops in and around Ukraine now. Most of them are outside of Ukraine, over 300,000 sitting in strategic reserve, ready to launch. Why? Because he doesn't want a war with NATO. And if we intervene, he's going to need all of those troops. So he's been holding back and holding back and holding back in the hopes that someone would sober up, wise up, and negotiate. Well, it's not going to happen. He found that out the hard way in the summer, which is why you got the large military buildup. I think he's discovering it again. And this is unfortunate because I think things are changing in Europe faster than they are changing here because, let's be frank, most Americans could care less what happens in Ukraine. They don't even know where it is, half of them. But for you, not so much perhaps the British, but certainly for the Europeans, this is next door. This is quite close. And once you move past the Poles and Lithuanians, there isn't much stomach among the Europeans for a major war with Russia for the simple reason that they don't see the need for it. So eventually, I think we're going to see governments change. I think Macron will be gone. I think Scholz will be gone. That will certainly help. And the real question is what happens in Britain, the other leading power on the in NATO, and I suspect that may change too, especially if you look at your bond market. We don't want to talk about that right now, but nevertheless, that's a real danger, I think, to the current British government. So I think he's betting that the Europeans will sober up faster than we will. We're just going to continue to throw coal on the fire, just keep it going on the assumption that somehow or another this benefits us. It doesn't benefit us in any way, shape, or form, but that's the attitude in Washington. And no one is going to stand up and say, by the way, we didn't do our jobs. There was no purpose, method, end state thinking. There is no strategy. We don't know what to do. We can't do much anymore. We're just going to continue to shove obsolescent equipment at Ukrainians.
Well, I mean, right now, the Biden White House has to continue on this. If anything, it maybe helps him to get a chance of re-election, but that's the only reason they're funding this. They can't walk it back, and so that's going to continue until the elections next year. You mentioned in a recent interview that you mentioned the fools in London, and you said that island could become a death trap for them. You also talked about how Boris Johnson was sent over, maybe from the Biden White House, to talk to the Zelenskys. Tell me about what we're doing here wrongly or rightly in London.
Well, I don't remember saying death trap, but I may have. I think the British are on a very dangerous path. I mean, if you look at your own armed forces, I mean, it breaks my heart to look at the British Army. It's a shadow of its former self. And the British Army, even though it was always smaller than the U.S. and German armies, for instance, was usually regarded as a very professional and competent organization. I think today it's just a skeletal framework of what's needed. You've got 2 aircraft carriers that you've invested heavily in, no aircraft to put on them. They're not manned. I don't know what you're going to do with them, but no one bothered to think through carefully, what are we going to do with aircraft carriers? I mean, that's the current white elephant of the new era. It's analogous to the battleships that we once had in great numbers. Those things are easy to pinpoint and easy to sink. And I think the British, for some reason, well, I guess it's quite clear the British people have chosen not to really question very thoroughly what their politicians say and do about Russia, which is astonishing to me. Because Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's not remotely like it. There is no communist party running the show. You don't have the NKVD rounding up thousands of people and imprisoning them or executing them every day. Although I'd say the Zelensky regime is probably closer to that in reality than anything happening in Putin's Russia. And so the British have worked themselves into a corner, much like ourselves, and there's no way out. So what could happen? And then the possibility that the SAS, which has always been very, very good, but seems to have been very, very active in Ukraine, could go too far and provoke the Russians in ways that I think could be.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.